Welcome to the Two Perspectives Show with me, Reverend Lee Wolak, and my cohort, Dr. Naranjan. And we're here today to talk to you about change. One of the things that I've come to understand throughout my years that every year things seem to go faster and faster and faster. And as I thought about what's going to be happening tomorrow in 2020, is that change is going to speed up even more. And so we're going to be confronted with change in so many ways, in so many aspects that affect everything about our lives. How do we use change? How do we deal with change? What's the best way to be with it? And so we're going to start off and explore, is change a friend or is change an enemy? I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Naranjan and get his perspective on how he sees change affecting our lives starting now.
Change. What an appropriate topic. Today is the 31st of December and 2020 is just around the corner. And change seems to either affect us in a positive way or a negative way. Is change avoidable? Well, the fundamental law of nature is about change. And we are not exceptions to this law. The reason being, our body is part of nature. It has the same elemental composition as other species in nature. The mind is not under this law of change as far as nature is concerned. So the mind is a bridge between the changing nature outside and the changeless being that we truly are. The body cannot avoid change, but the mind, we bring about change to the mind, or we change as a result of what is going on in the mind as our habits and conditioning. So change is not avoidable, but change can also be used to our benefit. When we look out at objects in nature that are constantly changing, evolving, change is either slow or rapid. So we have the organic material in nature and the inorganic material. Organic material being things like food, inorganic material being things like stones and rocks. Inorganic material changes, but it changes very, very slowly over millions of years, well beyond the time scale of us humans. But there are other things that undergo rapid change. And in between are our possessions. We invest a lot of our emotions and our sense of identification into our possessions. And as soon as we buy something, it brings about a change within us, a positive change in terms of making us happy. And as we hold on to the possession, over time that happiness is replaced. So that change is something that we want to replicate, the change of being happy. And we do a lot in our lives to make ourselves happy. The big question is happiness as a result of change sustainable or not?
What's real interesting is that since we began this podcast just minutes ago, my body's not the same body as it was when we started. Already, millions of cells have died and new ones have been created. Do you realize in our bodies there's somewhere they estimate between 50 and 100 trillion cells? And almost once a year, 90% of those cells are replaced, sometimes many times, depending on the body part. And so when we understand that our body is never the same, that our body is constantly changing, then we start to move into the aspect of the mind. And Naranjan brought up this really great idea about happiness and joy and how it affects us and whether or not we can keep that going in our lives. And I'm going to bring this out and say no. Because change brings contrast. Contrast allows an expansiveness of our mind. See, we have to expand our mind to deal with contrast. With the newness, it actually allows us to raise our level of awareness, which is our natural tendency. That's what's within me and within you and with everybody, is the desire to become more aware, to experience a broader form of life. And you cannot experience a broader form of life without change. If every day was the same thing, it would be absolutely boring, monotonous. We just want to just take a gun out and blow our brains out, because why live? Change gives life its juice. But the key thing is, how do you deal with that change? If you're trying to stay and live in the 1950s, change is going to bring you great pain. If you're going to embrace change and say, how can I take this forward in my life now? Change can be the greatest gift that you were ever given. It's your perspective and how you see change and your ability to use it to expand your awareness that brings you a greater experience of life itself.
The point about perspective on change, that is critical. What our perspective is. We could leave home in the morning on our way to work, and our lives could change if something happened on the way. For example, an accident. Recently on one of my trips, I was fortunate enough to meet this gentleman who embraced the change, the dramatic change that happened in his life, and he turned it for the better. This gentleman, he's about 50, 55, was the fire chief of a large town. 3 years ago, there was a big, massive house fire, and he was helping out, and he got burned, was hospitalized on life support. The doctors gave his wife no hope and said, no, it's time for his last rites. So they called the chaplain and administered last rites, not once, but 3 times. But his wife refused to give up. He said, if nature decides that it's his time, that's okay, but I'm not going to pull the plug. So this man laying in his hospital bed with a tube going down into his lungs through his throat on maximum life support miraculously pulls through. If you see him today, you would never guess what he went through. Unfortunately, he could not work again as a fireman. So what did he decide to do with his life? He's got half of one foot missing. He goes into nursing school. Why? Because of the wonderful nursing care that he had in the hospital and the wonderful medical care that kept him alive. And he wanted to give back. And he said, I'm not back in the workforce to earn a living or a paycheck, but to give back. And to me, that is such a powerful example of how someone embraces a life-changing situation, a life or death situation, and turns it into a positive, not for themselves, but for others.
That reminds me, Niranjan, of last Friday night. My wife and I went out to dinner. We took our granddaughter. We were coming out of the restaurant. We'd finished, and she met this gentleman there that recognized her, and it turned out it was a doctor at the hospital where she works. And she talked to the doctor. We had a conversation and that type of thing. And we moved off. And Jean says, don't you remember him? And I said, no. I said, you went to him, Lee. And I went, what? She says, yeah, he was the doctor that called you on the phone and told you that you had an acoustic neuroma in your brain. And I went, that was the blah, 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 blah. And she says, yeah. And I said, I didn't feel that energy anymore. What happened was this doctor, I had a hearing problem. He put me in an MRI. He got the results of the MRI and he called me. And while I'm driving to a retreat, he tells me that I have a brain tumor. Well, that's a change, Niranjan, right there. And what ended up happening, and he asked what happened, I said, well, I became a vegan and I visualized every day Pac-Man going into my brain and eating up the tumor. And I said, a year later, I went back and had an MRI and I went to a specialist. And when he looked at the new MRI, the brain tumor was gone. And the doctor sort of looked at me when he heard that and he sort of said, well, it might have been just a mistake on the original MRI. but that was the doctor from his perspective. But what I knew is that the change that happened because of that diagnosis and because of everything, I changed my life by changing how I ate, how I viewed it, and it made me a better person. Now, what was interesting is I asked Jean, well, why didn't I pick up the same negative energy that I had with him before? And she says, because 3 years ago, he had a near-death experience where he almost died. And as a result of that experience, he became a different person. Everyone in the hospital, everyone that knew him saw the difference immediately. So things that are catastrophic can be the greatest blessings in our lives, depending on the perspective and how we look at them and how we choose to deal with them.
Let's hope nothing catastrophic happens to anybody. And hopefully it's a wonderful and prosperous, peaceful, and healthy new year for all of us. We can look at change not from an external perspective, but also from an internal perspective. There's constant change going on in our own mind. Every thought is like a wave that comes and goes, comes and goes, comes and goes. Imagine going to the seashore and saying, okay, I like that particular wave out there. I'm going to hold it in my hands. The moment you hold it, the wave disappears. You disrupt its energy. And what's left is you're holding on to nothing, but just an image of that wave that you identified with. That's exactly what we do in our mind with our thoughts. There's an incessant undulating pattern of mental energy, and that undulating pattern, we call it thought. When we see a form which we identify with, we hold on to it. But the moment we identify with it, we disrupt that flow of energy, and what we're left with is an emotion. It could be a positive emotion or a negative emotion. And that emotion gets translated into our memory, and it forms a virtual DNA of our conditioned lives that we are currently leading. But if we look at it from a different perspective and say, you know, it's a beautiful sight. It's not just one wave out there or one thought out there, but there are thousands of them. And I can see them better, and I can appreciate them better and enjoy them better if I step back and take a look at how they play out, coming in towards us and then receding back into where they came from. It's all a play, a dance, if you will. And it's up to us if we want to enjoy it in the moment and then let it go, or if we want to bring it home into our emotional bedrooms and then put them over there and hope that they give us happiness at some point down the road. But that may not always happen. So how do we deal with this incessant flow of thoughts? We are looking at it from a subjective perspective. So the subjective center of perception is the mind. So the mind, the eyes, and the whole brain-mind complex, we can consider that as the subjective perspective from which we look at the world. But then if we step back from the mind, then the body and the mind and the undulating energy of thoughts becomes the objective, part of the objective, and the subjective is something else. And that something else is our changeless power of awareness. And the beauty about this changeless power of awareness is there is really no emotional attached to it in the sense of having a memory or a recall. It's perceived in the moment and it's let go in the moment. Change also implies comparison, as Reverend Lee mentioned earlier. We tend to compare a lot of things in our lives, the past to now, now to the projected future. Everything is a comparison. If there's no comparison, then it's hard to say that there's a change. Everything is new and as it is in this very moment. And if we can change our perspective to that of being aware of the change and the space in which this change takes place, then we are less subject to the changes either bringing a positive influence or a negative influence. Because from the perspective of awareness, there's neither a positive or a negative. Like an electric socket, which you have three prongs on a plug that you put in a socket. One is the positive pole, one is the negative pole, and one is the neutral pole. Well, the body is also an electric phenomenon. The mind, the brain, and the heart, we know the brain and the heart, they give out electric waves. So the mind has taken two of these poles, the positive and the negative. And the power awareness stays in between, the neutral element. So if you stay in the neutral element, then we're neither affected by positive or the negative. Change doesn't come and affect us, but for being neutral, we can be more objective in how we bring about change in the world for the better.
That brings me right to the point about what meditation does. And the quickest thing I can say about meditation allows me to step back and be the observer. And one of the things that when I teach people that as you meditate and you build that practice every day, it buys you 3 seconds. So that when something happens, as opposed to reacting, you can respond. And I think that is the key to life. Because when you're reacting, it's those old habits that are built up in our mind, those old habits that we have no control of, that we never really consciously chose, they demonstrate themselves. But if you have 3 seconds, that's a long time. And when something happens, your mind automatically goes, okay, what can I do here? What good can come out of this? What's a different way of looking at this? And I think that when you're dealing with change and you can have 3 seconds to respond to it rather than react, you're in control of your life. You are living as an aware being on this planet. And right now, if we can step back, we cannot let our emotions control us with everything that is happening around us, and we can become the observers, we can embrace change in ways that we've never even dreamed of. And we can raise our awareness, and as we raise our awareness and we respond to things, others will feel that energy and they will see that it is possible not to react, not to be in our reptilian brain and be an animalistic response to things. So what I want to say to you folks out there listening, you're about to begin 2020. I would highly advise you to consider that change is going to be a regular part of your life and to embrace change. But I would also ask you to step back into the observer role in whatever way that helps you to do that. And I'd highly recommend a meditation practice. If you build that and you can respond to the change that's happening, you are in control of your life. So I want to leave that challenge with you. Embrace change and find a way to step into the observer role. If we can do anything for you, write it in the comments section of this video. And by the way, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe now and share it with all your friends because we want to get this message out. And anything you think we can do better, let us know because we are open. Until next time, Niranjan and Lee signing out saying aloha.